Your legs worked fine. You could run for hours across open ground, through grass, over dry riverbeds, not fast, not compared to most things that could eat you, but steady in a way almost nothing else could match. You woke up, and your body was already at its best, and then the sun started to set. Everything you relied on, the distance you could see, the angles you could read, the sounds you could separate, started to collapse. Within 30 minutes of the light going, you were operating at a fraction of what you were, and something else was just getting started. That gap between what the day gave you and what the night took away was the central fact of your existence. Not hunger, not rival groups, not disease. The gap, in 2005, anthropologist Stephen Kuhn at the University of Arizona published an analysis of early human campsites going back to the Middle Stone Age. What he kept returning to was not what people made or what they ate. It was where they chose to sleep, almost without exception, backed against something. A rock face, a dense stand of trees, the wall of a ravine. Every site shared the same logic. They had reduced the number of directions the dark could come from. This was not comfort. This was triage. You entered the night with maybe 4 hours of reliable vision and a nervous system that had no off switch. Somewhere beyond the edge of whatever fire you had managed to keep lit, the sounds kept going, the grass moved, something exhaled, and your brain, which was not built to rest through any of that, stayed on. Researchers studying modern humans in environments without artificial light. Specifically, a 2015 study by Jerome Siegel at UCLA tracking the Hadza of Tanzania and San groups in Namibia found something that cut against a century of assumptions about sleep. These groups did not sleep 8 hours. They did not sleep in one continuous block. They averaged about 6.5 hours, broken by long stretches of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, and they almost never reported insomnia. That middle stretch, the one we have spent decades diagnosing and medicating, was not a malfunction, it was a patrol. The fire needed tending. You needed to know the fire was still there. The sounds at the perimeter needed sorting. A branch settling versus a branch bending under weight, those are not the same sound. You knew the difference without knowing you knew it, and the only reason you knew it was that your brain had been cataloging sounds like that since before you could walk. The darkness was the hardest part, but not because of what it contained, because of what it required you to become. Here is what that actually looked like on a body. You had been walking since before sunrise, tracking. Probably whatever you were following had gone in a direction that added miles to a route that already had too many. By the time you stopped, your feet had covered somewhere between 8 and 15 miles of uneven grounded shoes, if you had them, that provided almost nothing by way of cushioning. The joints absorbed that, the lower back absorbed that. By middle age, and middle age, for most of human prehistory, meant somewhere in the late 30s. The spine showed it. Physical anthropologist John Kappelman at the University of Texas has documented skeletal remains from early Homo sapiens sites across the Middle East and Africa showing vertebral compression and joint wear consistent with sustained high load activity starting in adolescence and compounding steadily through adulthood. The bones were strong. They were also used hard. Food was the other axis of this. Not whether there was food. For most of human prehistory, there was food. Not always enough, not always enough, not always the right kind, but the landscape was not empty. The harder problem was the calorie math. A human body running at the level required to hunt large game, to track across distance, to carry a child or a kill or both, burned somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 calories a day. The foods that reliably provided that, marrow, fat, tubers dense enough to matter, were also the hardest to get to. Bone marrow required you to get the bone. That sounds obvious until you account for what was standing between you and the bone. Whatever had made the kill was usually still nearby. Hyenas do not abandon a carcass politely. Lions do not wait for you to finish. The strategy documented in scavenging behavior studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups and inferred from cut, mark patterns on fossil bones was speed, get there, work fast. Take what you can carry, leave before you have to defend it. The marrow was worth it. A single large femur from a wildebeest or an equivalent animal contains around 700 calories in fat, roughly a third of what a moderate day requires. In one concentrated package the size of your forearm. Ancient humans knew this. The oldest stone tools we have found, from sites in Ethiopia going back 3.3 million years, are not spear points. They are cobble-shaped specifically to fracture bone, not to kill, to open. Which means the first thing we can say for certain that our ancestors built a tool to do was this: extract calories from something another predator had already killed, and that changes the picture considerably. We have spent a long time imagining the ancient human as apex hunter, the persistent killer, the dominant figure on the savanna, that version is not false, but it is late. For most of the time, there have been things that look like us. We were something closer to a very clever opportunist operating at the edges of bigger predators' meals. The evidence that complicates the apex story is not subtle. Cut marks on ancient bones show butchering patterns that run over tooth marks, not under them, which means in many cases the carnivore was there first. Paleoanthropologist Manuel Domínguez Rodrigo at the Complutense University of Madrid spent years analyzing these mark sequences at multiple African sites and found a pattern that held across locations and time periods, primary access to large animals. The first cut, the best cut, the marrow, was inconsistent. Sometimes we got there first, more often something else did. The apex story held for so long partly because of what it felt like we should have been, and partly because the evidence that contradicted it requires very close attention to the sequence of marks on bones that are millions of years old. So set aside the image of the dominant hunter standing over a kill. What you actually had for a much longer stretch of time was a social animal operating in small groups, watching the sky for vultures, because vultures circled carrion, moving toward the circle fast, competing at the edge of a carcass with animals that were larger and faster, taking what could be taken and leaving, and doing all of that on a body that had not slept through the night. This is where the social structure becomes impossible to separate from the survival math. A lone human in that environment had a very short life expectancy, not because of any single threat, but because of the cumulative weight of the gap. The dark required two people watching. The carcass required someone at your back. The infant required someone whose only job, for a period, was the infant. You could not do any of it alone and do it long enough to matter. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy at UC Davis has documented, across 2 decades of work on cooperative breeding in early humans, that the human infant is uniquely structurally dependent on multiple caregivers. Not as a cultural preference, but as a biological necessity. The human infant is born less developed than the infant of any comparable primate. It cannot cling. It cannot follow. It requires more calories through nursing than the mother can reliably source alone, while also maintaining her own body. The math only works if other people are providing for the mother while she provides for the infant. This is called alloparenting, and it shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. Grandmothers provisioning grandchildren, older siblings carrying infants, aunts providing food. The group was not a social preference. It was the feeding arrangement that made the infant viable. That means the hardest problem an ancient human faced was not finding food or surviving the night as an individual. It was maintaining the relationships that made individual survival possible at all. Because the group could fracture, people could disagree, people could take more than their share. Someone could be a poor guard, a poor hunter, a poor caregiver, and there was no contract and no institution to adjudicate any of it. What existed instead was reputation and memory and the accumulated social knowledge of who could be trusted to do what under what conditions you were. In other words, running a continuous evaluation of everyone around you and being continuously evaluated by everyone around you. And the stakes of that evaluation were direct. A 2011 analysis by anthropologist Kim Sterelny at the Australian National University examining the cognitive demands of small group social life in foraging populations argued that the complexity of managing nested social obligations, who owes what to whom, who is reliable, who is not, what debts are outstanding, what coalitions are forming, may have been a more significant driver of early human cognitive development than tool use or language independently. The tools and the language were part of it, but the underlying engine was keeping track of people. This also meant something about the emotional texture of daily life that is easy to miss. Every person in that group was irreplaceable in a way that is hard to fully translate into contemporary terms. If you had 5 adults and one of them died, you lost 20% of your defensive capacity, 20% of your food, gathering capacity, 20% of your knowledge base, 20% of your knowledge base, 20% of your childcare capacity. At the same time, there was no replacement, there was no waiting list. There was a gap where that person had been, and the group contracted around it, and everyone quietly recalculated what was now possible. Grief in that environment was not a psychological event. It was a logistical one. We talk about what they ate, we talk about how they moved, we reconstruct their tools and their shelters. We sometimes talk about their art, the ochre, the shells, the incised lines that suggest something was being communicated or commemorated or remembered. But the emotional architecture of running a high-stakes cooperative social system, day after day, in conditions that could remove any member of that system without warning, that part tends to get abstracted away into the background. The record does not let it stay there. Burials. We have burials going back over 100,000 years that show deliberate placement. Bodies arranged, ochre applied. goods included. That practice requires several things simultaneously: a concept of the person as distinct from the body, a social memory of who that person was, and a group that paused its immediate survival activity to perform something that had no immediate survival value. The Ful Cave site in Israel, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, contains multiple burials with clear evidence of intentional placement. These were not people dropped where they fell. They were people put somewhere by people who stayed long enough to do it carefully, meaning the hardest problem was not just survival. It was surviving while caring about the ones who didn't. Now here is where the conventional reading of all of this tends to land. The ancient human was tough, adapted, resilient in ways we have lost. The modern body and brain, stimulated and over-comfortable, are the degraded version of something that was once formidable. That reading is in every paleo diet book. It runs under most of the discourse around ancestral movement and ancestral sleep. It contains a real observation about mismatch between evolutionary history and present conditions, but it gets the direction of the difficulty wrong. The ancient human body was not better. It was narrowly optimized for a set of conditions that no longer exist, and that optimization came with costs that were brutal and continuous. Life expectancy at birth in foraging populations is typically estimated at somewhere between 25 and 35 years, accounting for high infant and child mortality. Those who survived childhood could live into their 60s, but childhood mortality ran at rates we now associate only with the worst disease environments on Earth. In some site analyses, more than 50% of recovered juvenile remains show evidence of dying before age 15. That is not resilience. That is enormous loss absorbed continuously by groups too small to absorb it easily. The ancient human was not tougher. The ancient human was living inside conditions where the margin for error was close to zero, and they did it not because they had something we have lost, though some things have been lost, because they had each other at close range with no alternative and no exit, in a system where everyone's failure was immediately and locally visible. That proximity created the cooperation created the survival. The survival created over hundreds of thousands of years the brain you are using right now to sit in a temperature-controlled room and read about people who never had either. Your nervous system still runs the old program at night. It catalogs the sounds. It surfaces you briefly at the edges of sleep cycles to check whether the fire is still going. It builds and maintains a detailed model of the people around you, not because you asked it to, but because that model was the price of admission for most of human history. You are not failing to sleep. You are still, in some functional sense, on patrol. The hardest part of being an ancient human was not the cold or the hunger or the predators or the dark. Those were the conditions. The hardest part was that surviving all of it required you to stay bound. Through grief and conflict and the constant arithmetic of who was still here and who wasn't to the people who were surviving it with you. That requirement didn't go anywhere. It just got much easier to avoid.